4, 3, 2, 1.
The House Committee on the Judiciary will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. We welcome everyone to this morning's Member Day hearing, which we are holding pursuant to Section 3A of House Resolution 8. Before we begin, I would like to remind members that we have established an email address and distribution list dedicated to circulating exhibits, motions, or other written materials that members might want to offer as part of our hearing today. If you would like written materials, please send them to the email address that has been previously distributed to your offices, and we will circulate the materials to members and staff as quickly as we can. I would also like to remind all members that guidance from the Office of Attending Physicians states that face coverings are required at all meetings in an enclosed space, such as committee hearings, except when you are recognized to speak. This includes all members waiting to testify. In the interest of time, I have a very eloquent opening statement, which I will put in the record. Mr. Gomert, you have an interesting, eloquent opening statement?
Yes, just ask if we entered into the record.
Which will be entered into the record. Our first witness is the Honorable Matt Rosendale.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Jordan, and members of the Judiciary Committee for allowing me to testify about my legislative priorities within the committee's jurisdiction. Our nation is currently dealing with multiple crises that your committee is uniquely qualified to address. First, I would like to speak about the humanitarian, public health, and national security emergency taking place at our southern border. On his very first day in office, President Biden began to systematically dismantle the successful immigration policies of the Trump administration. He stopped construction of the border wall system, brought back Obama-era catch-and-release policies, undermined interior enforcement, and attempted to end migrant protection protocols commonly known as the Remain in Mexico policy. That's why I've introduced H.R. 1259, the Remain in Mexico Act, which would codify the Trump administration's Remain in Mexico policy. Under this successful policy, illegal aliens who arrived at our southern border and claimed asylum were returned to Mexico while they wait for asylum claims to be adjudicated if they did not meet the credible fear test. This effectively ended the Obama administration's catch-and-release policy, led many who made frivolous claims to return to their country of origin, and acted as a strong disincentive for foreign nationals to make the treacherous journey to our country. The Biden administration's attempts to end this policy and gut other Trump-era border policies have led to record-breaking numbers of illegal aliens flooding our country, putting American citizens at risk. That's why I believe it's critical the committee take up the Remain in Mexico Act and put a stop to this unfortunate and avoidable calamity. Next, I would like to speak to the refugee crisis created by President Biden's botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, which led to the administration evacuating over 100,000 Afghan nationals who they have begun to resettle across our nation. These Afghans have not gone through the traditional 14-step, 18-month vetting process required to get a special immigrant visa. In fact, most evacuees did not help our nation and are not eligible for an SIV. Most do not have refugee status. They were simply paroled into the interior of our country by Secretary Mayorkas and resettled across our nation. This is why I've introduced H.R. 5572, the Secure America Act. The Secure America Act would ensure thorough refugee vetting prior to admission and the authority of the Secretary of Homeland Security to parole aliens into our country and reclaim and expand the authority of governors.
Could I ask you a question here? Would you yield for a question?
Sure.
Just very quickly, with respect to the hundreds or thousand or so Afghans who are now already in the country, what would you do with them?
I'm on my way to that, Mr. Chair. I think that they have not been vetted and they should be returned.
To Afghanistan?
I do think that they should be returned to Afghanistan or neighboring countries that share their cultures. Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and other areas that they could assimilate much easier and also return to their native country once there is stability there. And it would be better for all involved, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. The Secure America Act would ensure thorough refugee vetting prior to admission and the authority of the Secretary of Homeland Security to parole aliens into the country and reclaim and expand the authority of governors and Congress over the process of admission and the resettlement of these refugees. We cannot compromise the security of our nation in the name of empathy, or we will continue to see instances of violence by Afghan evacuees like we have already seen in Fort McCoy, Fort Bliss, and most recently in Missoula, Montana. I believe the Secure America Act must be immediately taken up to ensure our immigration system preserves and protects our national security and our American way of life. Finally, I would like to address the surge of violent crime throughout the nation. According to a report released by the Federal Bureau of Investigation several weeks ago entitled Crime in the United States 2020, last year the number of homicides and non-negligent manslaughter nationwide increased by 29.4%, and aggravated assault offenses rose by 12.1%. Reports indicate the widespread violence and bloodshed has sadly continued into this year. This violence is clearly enabled by jurisdictions throughout the country considering and in many cases adopting measures to defund or disempower law enforcement. The failure of American cities to enforce the rule of law is why I introduced H.R. 3217, the Lawless Cities Accountability Act. My bill would defund cities and other municipalities that disempower or defund law enforcement, enabling anarchy and lawlessness. It is the responsibility of government to protect the lives and property of all American citizens from unlawful acts of violence and destruction. The federal government should not allow taxpayers' dollars to fund jurisdictions that fail to enforce the rule of law and protect their citizens.
The time of the gentleman.
I urge the committee to take up these important pieces of legislation, and I would yield back. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I forgot to read the obvious, which is that all witnesses should note that their written statements will be entered into the record in their entirety, and accordingly, they should summarize their testimony in 5 minutes. We'll now hear from the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the opportunity to speak about the American Music Fairness Act, a bill that I introduced with Congressman Issa from California. This bill will make a long overdue change to pay performing artists a small piece of the massive profits made by big radio stations to play their songs. Frankly, it's ridiculous that this isn't already happening. We expect every other business to pay for their raw materials. Restaurants pay for produce, builders pay for lumber. Corporate radio stations should pay for the music that they play. AM/FM radio makes a profit by selling advertising around music and other content. When you tune in to sing along with your favorite song or catch up on local sports, you also hear ads. You hear ads for local car dealerships, you hear ads for local furniture stores, but talk radio stations pay their hosts, and sports radio stations pay for play-by-play. DJs are paid to entertain, inform, introduce songs that bring in listeners. Songwriters are paid for the music and the lyrics. The artists singing and the musicians playing those songs, they're not paid at all. And the excuse that we often hear from radio broadcasters is that exposure is enough, that's the payment. But this isn't the 1960s. Every creator knows that exposure isn't how they pay the bills. Technology has changed a lot since the start of AM/FM radio. And we all know that publicity from radio airplay isn't how an artist breaks out into the mainstream. Most mainstream radio plays a small rotation of hits rather than breaking a wide range of new or independent artists. And I'd caution anyone who might suggest to legendary artists like Dionne Warwick that promotion is fair compensation when her songs like I'll Never Fall in Love Again are played on radio. She has over 500,000 Twitter followers. She doesn't need exposure. She needs to be paid fairly for her artistry. Congress fixed one injustice for pre-1972 recordings 3 years ago with the Music Modernization Act. But those rights still don't apply when the songs are played on radio. Dionne Warwick should have been paid in 1969, and she should be paid today when her songs are played on the radio. And here's the thing, it's only in America that we have this problem. Countries around the globe collect royalties for American artists, but even those royalties never make it. They never make it to our artists because we refuse to reciprocate. This costs American artists $200 million every year in royalties outside the US, and my bill would ensure that US artists get paid for domestic radio play and allow US artists to finally collect their international royalties. As we sit in this hybrid remote hearing, we should all be reminded of the hardship that artists have faced through the pandemic. As tours were postponed, venues were shuttered, but even as we stayed closer to home, we still got to enjoy the music on the radio, internet, satellite, and AM/FM. Now, satellite and digital music services are required to pay both performers and songwriters. It is only AM/FM radio that does not pay performing artists. Sometimes I hear that my bill is a threat to local radio. But small local radio stations pay only a nominal annual fee under the American Music Fairness Act. And the smallest stations would pay 2 cents per day to have access to this content. I value my local broadcasters. I want to ensure that they thrive in communities across the country, but I refuse to accept a corporate giveaway that hurts artists as necessary to protect small, local, independent broadcasters. The American Music Fairness Act will finally ensure that artists are justly paid. It will help the thousands of musicians who are struggling to make ends meet, whether their songs were hits many years ago or they're just starting out today. Fixing this deeply unfair system is the least we can do for the recording artists, for those musicians who have enriched our lives with their music. It's been an extraordinarily difficult time in our country throughout this pandemic. I think for so many of us, it is music that helped get us through this. It is only appropriate that we finally bring some fairness to the issue of the music business and make sure that these artists are paid for the incredible work that they provide to all of us. And I thank the chairman, ranking member, and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that this bill is identical to the Fair Pay, Fair Play Act introduced over a dozen years ago by then Congresswoman Marsha Blackburn and me. And the nominal fee the local broadcaster pays would pay is limited to $10 a year. So we will give this. I would like to see this pass as fast as possible. I've wanted to see it pass as fast as possible for at least a dozen years. So thank you very much. So next witness. Ms. Wagner, you're next.
I thank the chairman and I thank the committee for having this hearing today. Protecting children from exploitation is one of the most important responsibilities we all share as public officials. It is our job to ensure that the communities we represent are aware of the potential dangers facing children, that laws are properly enforced against those facilitating trafficking and abuse, and that survivors are given the support necessary to help them break free from exploitation. In July of 2020, President Joe Biden stated that he would prevent human trafficking across the globe by strengthening the rule of law. However, through the first 7 months of the Biden administration, over 112,000 unaccompanied children crossed our southern border. more than all of 2019 and 2020 combined. These minors are at the highest risk of being trafficked and exploited, and the criminal networks facilitating their abuse are making tens of millions of dollars. The administration's open border policies caused this humanitarian disaster, and the lawlessness must be stopped. The prevalence of human trafficking and sexual exploitation is not only increasing at the border, but in communities across our country as well. The pandemic has forced our children into isolation, where they are seeking out social interaction through the internet. Traffickers know this, and they have ramped up their grooming activity online, tricking oftentimes vulnerable children into trusting them and sending explicit photos and videos. Then using that sensitive material to extort the minors into engaging in sexual acts, both online and in person. Among the worst facilitators of this exploitation is the website onlyfans.com. In just this year alone, OnlyFans has been connected to human trafficking, selling child sexual abuse material, kidnapping, sexual battery, sexual servitude, extortion, and child rape. I'd like to submit for the record this letter outlining these crimes in detail.
Without objection.
My office has been in contact with federal agents, local detectives, and victim advocacy groups that are all sounding the alarm about the website and others like it. Homeland Security Investigations Special Agent Austin Barrier told us he sees up to 50 files of child sexual abuse material per day, Mr. Chairman, that have originated on OnlyFans. This is absolutely unconscionable. On August 10th, I led a very bipartisan letter with over 100 members of Congress calling on the Department of Justice to investigate this website. And after 73 days, I have yet to receive a response. In that time, the media has reported multiple crimes related to OnlyFans, including the human trafficking of a minor and aggravated child abuse. Department of Justice must act and stop this from happening to our children. With these horrific crimes on the rise, we must give law enforcement the tools to support survivors. And that is why I've also introduced H.R. 1527, the Homeland Security Investigations Victim Assistance Act, a bipartisan bill that would expand HSI's Victim Assistance Program. This vital program provides trained specialists to work alongside law enforcement to help trafficking survivors assist investigators in apprehending their abuser. I strongly urge this committee to pass this legislation and to help survivors get the justice that they deserve. And it is my sincere hope that this committee will join me in the fight against trafficking and force the administration to take substantive and immediate action to protect children at the border and across the United States. I thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. For members who were not here when I made this announcement, I would remind all members that guidance from the Office of Attending Physician states that face coverings are required for all meetings in an enclosed space, such as committee hearings, except when you are recognized to speak. This includes all members waiting to testify. Ms. Schreier.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Nadler. Thank you, Ranking Member Jordan, for hosting this Member Day today. I appreciate the opportunity to testify about my priorities as representative of Washington State's 8th Congressional District. I want to start by thanking the members of the Judiciary Committee for your work on many of the issues that are most important to me and to my constituents, including voting rights, farm worker visa reform, and addressing the backlog of green card applicants, among others. I'm joining you today to speak specifically about my priorities around public safety and policing reforms. In the last year, our country has had even more painful reminders of racial bias present in all our institutions that carries particularly deadly consequences in law enforcement. Meanwhile, there's been an increase in violent crime and homicide. This year, King County, Washington, has already seen more gun violence than in all of 2020. I do not believe in defunding the police and have never supported any effort to do so. It's wrong-headed and counterproductive to public safety. As we continue to discuss policing reform, it's really important to support police departments with the resources they need to do their jobs well and safely. Over the past year, I've had the privilege to ride with local police officers and hear their perspectives on how to keep our communities safe and build trust with communities of color. And I believe that if people and other elected officials would just pause to listen, we could make policing work really well for everyone. I ask this committee to continue work to address the following priorities for my constituents in the 8th District and addressed in previous legislation passed by this body. My proposed amendment to the Commerce, Justice, and Science Government Funding Bill would help police departments pay for body-worn cameras, an expensive instrument that both law enforcement and community members strongly support. There would be a special emphasis on smaller departments which seldom can afford the thousands of dollars needed to purchase body cameras or the resources and personnel to manage the footage. The second amendment I put forward in that bill would increase funding that police departments can use to hire mental health professionals. During ride-alongs and conversations with police departments throughout my district, I constantly hear from officers that their jobs would be so much easier if there were more mental health services in our communities. Pairing an officer with a social worker or other trained mental health professional can provide better service to all community members, victims, perpetrators, and people who just need help but haven't committed any crime. In addition to these two issues, I want to highlight several other common sense reforms that remain priorities in my district. Programs that build community relationships with police departments renew trust in these institutions, keeping both officers and community members safer. In Auburn, Washington, the police departments created a diverse police advisory committee to provide feedback and recommendations to the chief. Community-based programs like this help build trust and understanding and empower community members to engage with police in ensuring public safety. And while the vast majority of police officers work hard to serve the community equitably and with compassion, there must be accountability for those who don't, whether by gratuitous violence, corruption, or other inappropriate behavior. And a national database that tracks these bad actors will help ensure that they're not rehired elsewhere after demonstrating that they are clearly unfit to serve. Finally, as I mentioned, my priority is to ensure that all law enforcement have the resources they need to do their jobs well. And one critical component of that is access to training. All departments should have access to the training they need in de-escalation, in the proper use of non-lethal tactics, and best practices for engaging with specific populations and more. These common sense reforms will make our communities safer and support our law enforcement professionals to do their best work and serve their communities. Thank you for your leadership and your attention to the needs of my district, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back, and we thank her for her testimony. Mr. Bilirakis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and I thank the ranking member, Jordan, distinguished members of the committee, and of course, specifically my good friend, Louis Gober. It's an honor to speak before the committee this morning. One of my longstanding commitments as a member of Congress has been to promote the culture of life. I have co-sponsored and voted for measures that respect the sanctity of human life and encourage alternatives to abortion. I've also voted against legislation that would have allowed public funds to be used for abortions and will continue to do so. I'm proud to join my good friend from Missouri, Ann Wagner, as well as 200 of my colleagues in supporting H.R. 619, the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. H.R. 619 requires that healthcare practitioners who are present at the live birth exercise skill, care, and diligence to preserve the life and health of a child who survived an attempted abortion with the same degree of care that would be offered to any other child born prematurely at the same gestational age. After those efforts, the healthcare workers must transport and
The gentleman yield for a
child.
question?
Yes.
Isn't that already the law in every state? If a baby is born alive and you don't take proper care, that's murder under the laws of every state, I think.
Well, this is what the bill states.
But what I'm saying is, isn't that already the law?
Yeah, it is, at this particular time, there can be abortions after birth. This is what, that's my understanding. And we want to prevent that from happening anywhere in the United States. This bill also gives the mother a civil cause of action and protection from prosecution, recognizing that women are the second victims of abortion and promoting the dignity of motherhood. And I also want to say that, again, if it's already going on, why not put it in law and codify it? I urge the committee to advance this important bill to a vote of the full House, because I would hope we can all agree that a child born alive has a right to live. Another top priority of mine is supporting our law enforcement officers. During my time in Congress, I've worked with local law enforcement agencies to ensure they have the support they need to properly protect and serve our communities. I routinely meet with Pasco and Pinellas County and Hillsborough County Sheriff's offices and local police agencies to hear how they are working to keep our communities safe and how the federal government can be of assistance to them. Through these meetings, I have brought community leaders together with local law enforcement. It is critical that law enforcement and local residents have an open line of communication in order to understand the issues that each face and how they can best work together. This is something that is vitally important, and I'm proud to be able to facilitate these types of discussions. I'm committed to ensuring the safety and security of all communities by opposing efforts to defund the police, increasing funding for better police training, community policing, and equipment, including body cameras. Let me be clear for this, for the record, I have never and will never support defunding the police. Unfortunately, our nation has seen an uptick in attacks on law enforcement officers. In fact, the National Fraternity Order Police, that 51 law enforcement officers, they have said that 51 law enforcement officers were shot, 13 of whom died, and 40 ambush-style attacks as of June 30th, a 91% jump from the same time last year. It's really awful. In all of 2020, there were 48 ambush-style attacks, which left 60 officers wounded, 12 fatally, according to the group's 2020 summary. I'm a co-sponsor of two pieces of legislation that address the safety of our law enforcement officers, H.R. 3080, the Back the Blue Act, and H.R. 3079, the Protect and Serve Act. The Back the Blue Act establishes new criminal offenses for killing, assaulting, and fleeing to avoid prosecution for killing a judge, a law enforcement officer, or public safety officer. The Protect and Serve Act, which was introduced by my good friend, fellow Floridian, and former Duval County Sheriff John Rutherford, establishes a new criminal offense for knowingly assaulting a law enforcement officer and causing serious bodily injury or attempting to do so in circumstances that affect interstate commerce. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle say they are capable of supporting the police and the safety of their communities. let's come together and do that. If there are no objections, let's get on this bill and let's pass this bill on the floor of the House and send it to the United States Senate so we can save lives. I urge this committee to protect law enforcement officers and advance these critical pieces of legislation to the floor for a vote. I would like to thank the chairman. Thank you so much, the ranking member, and members of the committee again for inviting me to testify today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back.
Thank you.
Ms. Jackson Lee.
Good morning, Chairman, and to the ranking member. Thank you so very much for this opportunity to present at the Members' Day. Let me, because of my good friend who is here, simply acknowledge tragedy in my congressional district area and to offer sympathy to the family of Deputy Corrine Atkins, who was killed, Deputy Berthen and Deputy Garrett, both of whom were shot. I say this in sincere sympathy to those family members and to emphasize in the time that I've been here in the United States Congress on this committee, I have never seen anything but support and advocacy for the men and women of the law enforcement community. We will continue to do so, and I will continue to join you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, to do that because they are our protectors and they do protect and serve. We have certainly tried to work on a number of issues of which I will highlight as well. And I think we have been, over the years, concerned about victims, crime, and the way to ensure that justice in this nation is fairly distributed. And as Dr. King would said, that would roll down like righteous waters, as I paraphrase. So let me offer issues that we have actually moved forward on, and I will be brief in that, and then hope that we can move forward again as well. We were successful in marking up H.R. 40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans, which I am so delighted to see the enormity of support, including over 300 organizations from all backgrounds in our community, and in particular, the understanding that this is a historical framework that studies the trajectory of slavery, which lasted longer than the country is old, and to be able to discuss the way forward, which I think is extremely important. Just about a week ago, I spent time at Jewish synagogue in Illinois, and the enthusiasm of understanding was overwhelming, and I know that that would be the case as we move forward on that legislation to the floor. H.R. 1280 was the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that's been worked on extensively by all members of this committee, including our colleague and friend, Congresswoman Karen Bass. My point on this legislation is that there are many elements in this legislation that I think we can work together on. I hope as we continue to discuss with our colleague and others that we'll look at, in particular, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that was introduced. It was called the George Floyd Law Enforcement Integrity Act that Jason Crow joined me on in racial profiling, which should be particularly important to focus on. And we can come together on ensuring that our law enforcement has all the tools that they need, particularly in the backdrop of Police Week last week. We did a stupendous job working on Violence Against Women Act. We put the most profound legislation forward starting back in 2017, 2018. It was a hard-fought battle, but we worked to make sure that we balanced all of the legislation that others were interested in, including the money for, at that time, $291 million for DNA kits to help backlog in law enforcement. We had outreach to community-based organizations that were effective in dealing with bringing down violence. This month is Domestic Violence Month, and I'm wearing the purple colors to emphasize that. But the Violence Against Women Act was a vital and is a vital part of this effort. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, nearly 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner. So working with the Senate, I'm looking forward to this committee helping to push forward the Violence Against Women Act to final passage. We are working and did work on the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Act. I thought I would emphasize that simply because our work was stupendous, and we frankly need to look to the aspects of the other body to be able to help move that. And I would put on this record, no, this is not something that we could enact, but I do think a rolling filibuster would be appropriate for all of the voting rights laws that we would have. Let me also emphasize the spike in murders and gun violence, and it should be evidenced that we are seeing a spike in violence, and the device of purpose is as a gun. So I hope the storage bill can be passed.
The time of the gentlelady has expired. Ms. Green.
Thank you for having me today. I really appreciate you hearing my request. I have introduced House Res 57. These are articles of impeachment on President Biden for abuse of power in regards to his willingness to use his position of power to aid his son, Hunter Biden, and their business dealings. I've also introduced another article of impeachment on President Biden, which is HRES 597. This has to do with the national security crisis that President Biden has created with regards to the extreme threat at the southern border. I've introduced House Res 598, articles of impeachment on President Biden in regards to the failure in Afghanistan. And I've introduced House Res 596, articles of impeachment on President Biden for the COVID eviction moratorium and his willingness to use his position to try to do what he shouldn't be doing. We have three branches of power. Now, this is not an issue that is just important to me. This is an issue that's important to the American people. You see, the American people in polling just recently, there's a range between 60% of Americans that say that Joe Biden should be impeached, but it goes as high as 83% of Republicans think President Biden deserves to be impeached, 58% of independents, and 40% of Democrats agreeing that President Biden should be impeached for his failures to the American people as president. Let's talk about some of those failures. We can talk about the border alone. You see, here we have, and let's just talk about criminals coming across the border. U.S. Border Patrol has apprehended 9,728 illegal aliens with criminal records just in fiscal year 2021, in comparison to only 2,438 in 2020. This is a 325.8% increase in migrant encounters. It's up to 1.7 million migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border in fiscal year 2021, which ended in September. This is a massive increase in President Biden's failures to provide security for the American people. Also, Border Patrol agents arrested 53 illegal aliens with sex-related criminal convictions, and many of them had prior convictions for crimes involving a minor. In the same period in 2020, agents apprehended 58. In 2019, they apprehended 58 in total. 55 in 2020, 58 in 2019, but 353 in 2021. That is a massive increase. Let's talk about these types of convictions. These convictions include forcible sexual assault of a child under 14, sexual conduct with a person under 13, statutory rape, second-degree sexual assault of a child, and lewd acts with a minor. Del Rio sector in Texas, they have seen 3,166% increase in arrest of convicted sex offenders compared to the same time frame last year. This is a threat to the American people, and Joe Biden is failing on his job. We could go on with the statistics and the numbers, but I think plenty of people have done that already. So let's talk about what is the presidential oath of office. Joe Biden swore an oath. He said, "I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, and I will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States," and he is failing to uphold his oath. You see, Article 4, Section 4 says that the U.S. guarantees each state against invasion. Joe Biden is failing the American people by refusing to uphold the law and the Constitution. But Afghanistan is where it really hurt. You see, Article 3, Section 3, Joe Biden could be guilty of treason. Our law says that levying war against the U.S., adhering to the enemies of the U.S., and giving aid and comfort is treason. President Biden did that by arming the Taliban with our taxpayer-funded U.S. equipment and weapons. He abandoned Americans in Afghanistan and seems to have no interest in getting them back. And only worse, he failed to ignore the intel that there was going to be an ISIS bomber and 13 of our soldiers were killed. I asked this committee to bring my articles of impeachment forward in hearings and markup, and I thank you very much for your time.
The gentlelady yields back. Ms. Dean.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler and Ranking Member, for hosting today's Member Day hearing. I have had the pleasure of serving on this Judiciary Committee for the last 3 years, where we have done important work on behalf of our constituents, our rule of law, and our nation. And in these last 3 years, I can confidently say this committee and its staff have met the moment. How? Well, in our first hearing, Mr. Chairman, as you well know, in the 116th Congress, we talked about the issue, the urgent issue of gun violence. It was the first hearing on gun violence in decades. We listened to victims and passed universal background checks to protect communities from senseless gun violence. We worked to change the conversation around addiction, to treat it as the disease that it is, to save lives by passing legislation to end the criminalization of addiction, and to tackle the issue of opioid overdose. And we advanced legislation to protect the sanctity of the right to vote, as 17 Republican-led states across this country implemented restrictive voting laws. We crafted and passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. This committee has had tough conversations, yet we didn't descend into the cult-like chaos of fealty to one man who disregarded our rule of law and could not grasp that the Constitution did not give him unlimited power to pressure foreign leaders to support his election, to openly violate the Emoluments Clause, and to incite a deadly insurrection because his ego could not accept the defeat. Through the chaos, this committee has fought to protect our precious Constitution and honor our rule of law. So yes, because of his blatant disregard for our democracy, he joined a short list of presidents who were impeached by this body, and he found a way to historically distinguish himself and be impeached twice. Impeachment is a tool to uphold and defend the Constitution, not a toy to be taken lightly. Contrary to what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle may say, there's no comparison to former President Trump's behavior and President Biden. Leading up to the first impeachment proceedings, we saw a repeated attempt by the former president to discredit our democracy and a clear abuse of power. To quote impeachment manager Representative Schiff, President Trump compromised our elections. He will do so again. Truth matters little to him. Decency matters not at all. He obstructed our ability to conduct oversight and abused the power of his office. The president threatened the American people's right to a fair election, the very foundation of our democracy. That's why we were called to impeach. I am alarmed but not surprised by the laissez-faire attitude around congressional subpoenas demonstrated this week by former Trump administration officials. A select few of my Republican colleagues displayed the courage and actually spoke out against the actions of President Trump. However, there is an appalling silence from far too many across the aisle, as they scream over masks, but are silent over treason. For those of you who still doubt the validity of impeachment, ask yourself this. who called upon the mob, who continually spread the big lie declaring the election was stolen, who urged his supporters to stop the steal. The repeated talking points of the former president and his allies threatened our democracy, and when we survived, he turned to an actual assault on the buildings we sit in today. January 6th will forever be a stain on our nation's history. As a violent mob descended on this Capitol, I sat in the gallery with no idea what would happen next. He desecrated his office, and he invested in a big lie, enticed his supporters with it, and ultimately incited them to the violence that we witnessed on January the 6th. That's why we were tasked again with impeaching the former president, to uphold the sacred oath we took, and to present the facts to the American people. Again, the facts revealed a distinct pattern of behavior. As Republican President Teddy Roosevelt said, patriotism means stand by country. It does not mean stand by the president or any other public official. So my colleagues and I will continue the patriotic fight to protect our democracy by uncovering the truth. My Congressional Subpoena Compliance Enforcement Act was included in the Protecting Our Democracy Act to apply civil action to Congress against any person who received but ignores a congressional subpoena. We cannot allow individuals to lift themselves above the rule of law. When we reflect on our work these last 3 years, I think of the words of our late dear colleague Elijah Cummings. When we are dancing with the angels, the question will be asked, what did we do to make sure we kept our democracy intact? We spent the last 3 years trying to keep our democracy intact. I urge our colleagues across the aisle to join us. That is our solemn oath, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Meyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, for calling this hearing today and giving members the opportunity to highlight issues that are important to our constituents and potential solutions that we are working towards in order to address them. There's widespread agreement across the political spectrum that our current immigration system is not working the way it should. What we need now is a more thoughtful, deliberate, and bipartisan approach to fixing the many problems currently plaguing that system. Securing our border and reforming a broken legal immigration system should not be mutually exclusive. It's frustrating that the Biden administration's failed border policies have made any other immigration-related conversations that much more difficult. We have all witnessed the unprecedented crisis on our southern border since President Biden took office, and I've joined my colleagues on the Homeland Security Committee in demanding the administration take the necessary steps to address it. Earlier this year, we traveled to the border to see the situation firsthand and talk to law enforcement officers on the front lines who are dealing with this overwhelming circumstance on a daily basis. Border security is simply not an issue for southern border states alone. It is one of the most consistent issues I hear directly from my constituents. They have serious concerns about what they are seeing from this administration. Major concern for Americans all across the country as the impacts of inadequate border policies are felt widely. Earlier this year, when the administration was overwhelmed by the number of migrants coming across the border, they were forced to open several emergency intake sites across the country, including in my district in Michigan. Now, we're proud to be able to step up, but again, this is not an issue for southern border states alone. And frankly, it's embarrassing that some members of this body dismiss common sense border security improvements because of the state of political rhetoric. Back in April, I was proud to join my colleagues in introducing H.R. 2321, the Border Surge Response and Resilience Act. This bipartisan bill would require DHS and federal partners to establish a comprehensive plan to manage a border surge before it becomes unsustainable. The bill would also establish a fund designated solely for implementation of this plan, allowing DHS immediate access to needed resources to address these challenges without waiting months for supplemental appropriations from Congress. We cannot allow these types of crises to continue administration after administration. Congress needs to take charge and provide clear directives and adequate resources for planning and surge response. This will reduce the risk of future humanitarian emergencies like the one we are seeing today, because frankly, it should not be difficult to both care deeply about the root causes of migration and also advocate for logical and humane policies that would ensure surges of individuals coming across the border does not reach a point where it's out of control and end up having an adverse effect on both local border communities and those vulnerable migrant populations. The administration has failed to take responsibility for this crisis or any of the actions necessary to address it. That is why I also join my colleagues in introducing H.R. 4828, the Border Security for America Act, to require DHS to resume construction of the border wall system, deploy effective technology to support Border Patrol operations, and provide more resources to CBP officers and agents on the ground at all U.S. ports of entry. Maintaining operational control and awareness across the border should not be a partisan issue. Frankly, it's a practical homeland security imperative. And as I've stated before, this administration's failure to secure the border has made it far more difficult for Congress to advance needed reforms of our legal immigration system. I'm proud to have joined my colleagues in several pieces of legislation to address some of these challenges, and I would encourage this committee to consider these efforts as well. H.R. 3215, the Temporary Family Visitation Act, would establish a new non-immigrant visa classification for individuals seeking to temporarily enter the U.S. to visit a relative who is a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident. This would ease the current obstacles that prevent families from being able to gather for occasions like holidays, birthdays, graduations, and weddings. H.R. 3897, the H-2B Returning Worker Exemption Act of 2021, would make key reforms to the existing H-2B program by exempting those returning workers from the numerical cap while supporting American employers who are dependent on the seasonal guest worker program and protecting American workers by enhancing anti-fraud and compliance measures. In Michigan, this is acutely felt in many of our seasonal industries who are suffering deeply because of the pandemic and suffering doubly because of failures of the H-2B program. And I was also proud to join my friend from Colorado, Mr. Crow, in introducing H.R. 5134, the Save Afghan Partners Act of 2021. This bipartisan bill would raise the Afghan special immigrant visa cap and clarify eligibility requirements for those who worked alongside the U.S. military and on behalf of the U.S. mission in Afghanistan. As we continue our efforts to resettle those vulnerable Afghans who've been brought to the U.S. and work to get out those of our allies who are left behind, this bill will be critical to ensure that those who risk their lives for the United States receive the status and benefits they deserve. There is a lot of room for us to work together on incremental but substantive immigration reform. The current system is riddled with illogical bureaucratic
The
obstacles.
time of the gentleman has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Bordeaux. I said that, Ms. Bordeaux. Use your mic.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, I'd like to speak about the importance of voting rights. Georgia has a long history of undermining the right to vote, from the Jim Crow-era tactics of poll taxes, grandfather clauses, literacy tests, to more recent tactics of voter roll purges, exact match policies, and partisan gerrymandering. As we know, these policies disproportionately affect voters of color. My district, Georgia's 7th, one of the most diverse districts in the country, has been ground zero for many disputes about these tactics, which repeatedly led to litigation. Some of the most long-standing disputes are around voter registration processes, including exact match policies, purges of voter registration rolls, and Georgia's no-excuse absentee ballot voting process. In 2016, voting rights organizations sued then Secretary of State, now Governor Brian Kemp, over the exact match policy for voter registration, a version of which had been struck down by the Department of Justice in 2009 under their preclearance review process. The exact match policy required the information on a voter's registration application to exactly match records kept by the Georgia Department of Driver Services or the Federal Social Security Administration, which meant that typos, data entry errors, or nicknames, such as someone who used the name Bill as a nickname for William, could jeopardize someone's voter registration. Georgia has also become one of the nation's most aggressive voter purge states. In 2017, over 500,000 voters were purged in one night, many due to Georgia's use it or lose it policy, which purges voters for not voting in prior elections. And these purges continue to this present day. Gwinnett County, the largest county in my district, has been ground zero for litigation over absentee ballot problems, with ballots rejected for signature mismatch or other technical administrative issues. In 2019, during early vote, Gwinnett County election officials rejected 1 in 10 vote-by-mail ballots. After litigation, a federal judge stepped in to ensure that ballots that were thrown out for signature mismatch were marked as provisional, and voters were given a chance to appeal the decision or confirm their identity. But even with this intervention, there were several serious problems with absentee ballot processing and inconsistent interpretation of ballot requirements between counties, which led to litigation in the following months and ultimately to significant changes in how Georgia administered absentee ballots. Most notably, in my district, there are 2 counties. In the more diverse county, small errors such as filling in today's date next to your signature on the absentee ballot would cause the ballot to be thrown out. Voters were supposed to put in their birth date. A similar ballot in the less diverse county in my district would be counted and the error treated as an innocent mistake. And this county was much more aggressive about notifying voters when there was an error on their ballot and giving them time to correct it. All of this formed the basis of successful litigation. Georgia dealt with many problems during the presidential preference, general election, and early voting period in the 2020 election cycle, leading to significant wait times of up to 12 hours for some voters. These problems made national news, with some of the longest waits occurring in the most diverse 7th District Gwinnett precincts. Despite the odds, Georgia had a record-breaking turnout during the general election. This was in part due to significant increases in turnout from minority communities, most notably Asian and Hispanic Americans. However, then, Georgia was one of the first states in the country to pass a voter suppression bill, SB 202, after the 2020 general election. In particular, this legislation targets Georgia's no-excuse absentee ballot voting. SB 202 includes provisions that require voter ID for absentee ballots, limits the use of absentee ballot drop boxes that were critically important to people voting in times of COVID. It bans nonpartisan groups from mailing out absentee ballot applications. This bill also forbids the distribution of food or drink to persons waiting in line, sometimes for many hours, to vote. But perhaps most alarmingly, the bill allows the State Board of Elections to remove a county election board after a performance review, audit, or investigation, and install a temporary superintendent, in effect creating the potential for a partisan takeover of local boards of elections. The State Board has already targeted Fulton County, the largest and one of the most diverse counties in the state, for takeover. This bill is one of many efforts by the leadership in Georgia to set election policies that limit voting in ways that disproportionately negatively affect voters of color. I'd like to commend the Judiciary Committee on your hard work in crafting H.R. 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and I look forward to supporting other meaningful reforms, such as the Freedom to Vote Act. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Mann.
Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Jordan, and members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today about the judicial priorities for the 1st District of Kansas, including the U.S. Department of Justice investigation into cattle markets, immigration, and the Second Amendment. Kansans are good people who carry a pioneering spirit with them, the same way those who settled my state did over 160 years ago. The people of the 1st District, aptly named the Big First, know each other, look out for each other, and sacrifice for each other. As Congress becomes increasingly more urban, rural districts like the Big First depend on strong voices in Congress, especially on some of the most significant issues facing our nation that are situated in the jurisdictional purview of this committee. The Big First backbone is agriculture. It is home to more than 60,000 farms. It is made up of farmers, ranchers, feedlot managers, nutritionists, ethanol producers, ag lenders, and agribusiness owners who feed, fuel, and clothe the world. It ranks #1 in the country for the value of cattle and calf sales at more than $9 billion sold annually and is home to more than 4.4 million cattle and calves. Cattle producers all over the country are facing challenging market dynamics, and Kansas cattle producers are especially concerned with the historically wide gap between wholesale beef prices and fed cattle prices. After several disruptive events in the meatpacking industry and the allegations of malfeasance, the U.S. Department of Justice began an investigation into potentially anti-competitive practices. As of today, however, we have not seen any results from this investigation. No real response to our concerns. No real outcomes for ranchers across the country. U.S. Department of Justice needs to complete the investigation and release these results immediately. Producers in Kansas and across the country deserve to know if the investigation uncovered any issues. 700 miles south of Kansas is our nation's southern border and a full-scale crisis created by President Biden and his administration. President Biden promised citizenship to up to 11 million immigrants, placed a short-sighted moratorium on deportations, rescinded policies that organized and controlled the flow of legal migrants, and halted the construction of the border wall system, even though Congress approved all the funds necessary for its completion. Predictably, the daily average of unaccompanied minors crossing the border has nearly doubled since 2019. Texas migrant facilities are well over 700% capacity, and the number of migrants testing positive for COVID-19 after being released has nearly doubled. Communities on the border are at risk. This is a human tragedy, and to stop it, President Biden and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security need to end these disastrous policies, secure our borders, refuse to grant broad amnesty, and develop a legal immigration system that works. Over the last 9 months, Americans have become used to the President Biden's homegrown crisis, and we're rightfully concerned, especially when it comes to our constitutional rights like the right to bear arms. Our founding fathers believed this right to be so integral to the freedom that they recorded it as the Second Amendment to the Constitution immediately after the right of free speech. It is a load-bearing wall and cannot be destroyed or diminished. President Biden recently penned 6 anti-Second Amendment executive actions in one day, banning homemade guns, defining a pistol as a short-barreled rifle, allowing for more regulation, and mandating a report on gun gifting and trading. In interviews following the announcement, the White House stated, "The President will not wait for Congress to act before the administration takes our own steps, fully within the administration's authority in the Second Amendment. We can no longer sit idle and watch dozens of executive orders from a single administration attempt to dictate the direction of our country with no input from this Congress. Congress was created to legislate. Governing by executive order is not legislating." Earlier this year, I introduced H.R. 716, the More Accountability is Necessary Now Act, requiring the executive branch to notify the American public and Congress with its intent to issue any new executive order pertaining to the rights of law-abiding Americans to own, carry, and use firearms guaranteed by the Second Amendment. Congress should swiftly pass this legislation. As your committee continues to work on legislation like this and other legislation within your circle of control, I ask that you ensure Americans in rural communities are part of the conversation. Their livelihoods are impacted by the decisions that you make in this very room. And when I see others playing fast and loose with their rights, I will always speak up on their behalf. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak on the issues impacting the 1st District of Kansas, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Member Gohmert, thank you, sir. Other members. Mr. Chairman, before I read from my prepared remarks, the Lord speaks to me sometimes, not in an audible voice, but he does speak to me. When COVID broke out, I heard about folks committing suicide, and I prayed and asked God, what could we do? I just think suicide is it's just worst despair you could have. I've had buddies kill themselves. And so I woke up in the middle of the night and I thought, dadgummit, I'm just gonna give my cell phone number out to folks. And people called me from all over the country. I had people calling me from out of the country that were locked in, and some people were just calling to see if there was an actual congressman would answer the dadgum phone, and I did. And it got so hectic that I had called in a buddy of mine who helped me on the campaign to help me, and we referred folks to, suicide prevention, and there was people, one lady was being abused in another state, and it's just all over the country. It was unbelievable, the amount of people, and of course, with the time change, my wife said, "Baby, you're gonna have to figure out what we're gonna do about this," because they were calling in the middle of the night, and so, but we took care of that, and God spoke to me again, because I was on the internet and I was looking and I was seeing that we're seeing a lot of kids disappear, and a lot of them are black kids, and nobody seems to be paying a dadgum bit of attention to them, Mr. Chairman, and that's what I'm here to talk to you about. And I'm going to read you from my remarks now, just give you that little heads up to what I was going at. And I want to thank you for giving non-committee members the opportunity to testify, Mr. Chairman. I come before the Judiciary Committee today to share with you an issue that the federal government and, frankly, American society does not give enough attention. Congress's Missing and Exploited Children's Program, overseen by the U.S. Department of Justice, makes America a safer place for our children. In late 1970s, nearly 1.8 million children were reported missing annually. In 2020, that number had fallen to 540,000, according to Congressional Research Service. This data shows, thanks to this program's improved policing tactics, recovery rates for missing children have exponentially increased. Unfortunately, this program falls short of serving people of color, and primarily black folks. Existing data indicates minority children are reported missing at a disproportionately higher rate than white children and staying missing longer. In fact, a longitudinal study found that racial differences significantly affect rates of recovery for missing minority children, with black children remaining missing the longest. These disparities are largely attributed to socioeconomic background, police resources, and media attention. In areas with low community engagement and limited police resources, children are more vulnerable and less likely to be recovered. It's a fact, and it's why movements like defund the police are so dangerous. Quality media attention on missing person cases is a proven key to recovery. According to the Department of Justice, intense early media coverage ensures that people will be looking for your child. It is concerning to me that missing white girls receive disproportionately more media attention than black counterparts. Look no further than the Gabby Petitio case, can't pronounce her name, but everybody knows who I'm talking about, which continues to captivate a national audience. Over the last 2 months or so, you couldn't turn on the news or scroll through Twitter without hearing about her. It continues to feel like she is the only missing person in America. But it's very serious that she is missing. And that is so far from the truth. There's no shortage of tragic stories about missing black folks that people have never heard about. I'll use an example from my district in East Tennessee. A 26-year-old black female from Knoxville was reported missing on June 28, 2021, and the last time her family heard from her was June 18th. This was weeks before Gabby Petitio was reported missing on September 11th. Thanks to national media coverage, though, Ms. Petitio's remains were found just 8 days after she was reported missing. Compare that to when the remains of the 26-year-old black female from Knoxville were recovered. She was not found until September 28, 3 months, Mr. Chairman, after she was reported missing. I bet not once over these 3 months you ever heard about her on MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, or the other national media outlets. The sad reality is that there are thousands of other stories like this one I just described to go completely unnoticed. There's an epidemic of missing black children, missing black girls. I have a little girl. She's 14. This is unreported by the mainstream news media. The news media is an echo chamber solely focused on news that sells and the ratings its target audience. Real news, unbiased news, important news has been pushed aside and replaced by...
The time of the gentleman has expired. Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Put on your mic.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler. I'm appearing today because I'm gravely concerned about Attorney General Merrick Garland's recent memo to the FBI directing them to intimidate and harass parents who show up at school board meetings. Sadly, one example cited by the National School Board Association was a father who showed up to the school board meeting because his 14-year-old daughter was sexually assaulted in a school bathroom by a boy who was allowed in the girls' room because of the school's transgender policies and activism. The father was trying to warn board members and other parents about the real-world implications of the left's radical agenda and the danger posed to teenage girls, but tragically, he was arrested and then labeled a domestic terrorist. This is chilling and anti-democratic action by the Biden DOJ. It's to use fear, harassment, and intimidation to keep parents from showing up at school board meetings and speaking out against the radical left-wing agenda. Parents are in charge of their child's education, period. Not the experts from the left-wing organizations, not the teachers' unions, and not the Biden administration. Parents. If the Department of Justice is looking for congressional direction on how they should be using their taxpayer-funded resources, they should start by investigating and prosecuting the human trafficking cartels that have smuggled, unbelievably, 125,000 children across our southern border under this administration. The children face horrific sexual assaults from cartel predators and coyotes. The DOJ seems to have a strong preoccupation with prosecuting and persecuting American citizens for engaging in constitutionally protected activities. I would strongly recommend the DOJ focus on keeping Americans safe and prosecuting child traffickers.
Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter articles for the record on this topic.
Without objection.
Thank you. And I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to speak to the committee today. I come to you to speak about a background check bill. After the killings of the 9 people in the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, by a deranged individual, the families of the deceased sued the federal government for failure to catch his issues before they issued him a permit to buy the gun. And the case was dismissed on sovereign immunity, but the federal judge, an Obama appointee, by the way, Gergel, wrote a 20-page opinion about the failure of the background check system in that case. And I've got a copy of that opinion here, and I would like to have it entered in the record.
Without objection.
And what glares at you when you read this opinion is about a big omission in the background check procedure. You see, the FBI maintains 3 criminal databases. And when they do a background check, for some reason, they only search 2 of those databases. And the third one is far more thorough and detailed, and it's called the index system. I think the reason that they only search 2 is because when we did the background check law in the mid-90s, the index system did not exist. And the inertia of the federal bureaucracy does not allow for changes. So if they actually had searched the index system, they would have discovered that Dylan Roof, who ended up massacring these people in this church, should not have been able to buy a gun. Now, the FBI will not give me information on other individual cases, but I also suspect that Mr. Cruz, who massacred the people in the Marjorie Stoneman High School, would not have been able to buy a gun. In fact, the police had been to his house over 20 times. And I suspect had they been able to search the index system, they would have found this. And he would not have been given a background permit. Also, the individual who went into the church in Texas, who had had issues with domestic violence before, I suspect that if they had looked at the index system, he would not have been able to buy a gun. The individual in Ohio who went into Dayton and started shooting downtown, and he had had mental issues before. If they had looked at the index system, I suspect he would not have gotten a permit to buy a gun. Now, I have a bill here that simply says that when the FBI does a background check, that they may check the index system. This, too often when we see tragedies like this, in our immediate reaction, we try to go too far and we can't find a solution that we can get across the line. And there have been numbers of bills that have been put forth by folks on the other side of the aisle that go too far, and therefore nothing has happened. No bills have passed that would solve this problem. And the response by the folks on the left is, well, you know, Republicans don't want to do anything, but I can tell you that pretty much everybody agrees that we need to do everything we can to keep guns out of the hands of the mentally ill. And this is a very, very straightforward and simple solution. I've got, this bill has 34 co-sponsors, including 4 Democrats, 30 Republicans. In fact, Mr. Cohen on this committee has co-sponsored this bill. This is a very common sense solution that would have prevented most of these massacres that, in fact, if we could prevent one, we could prevent copycats, right? I mean, people read about these things and they want the notoriety. So let's stop pointing fingers. We got to realize we've got to get a majority, right? We've got to reach consensus. Let's do something we can get across the line. This would be a real solution that would affect that would lift this Congress, that would lift the federal government, that would lift our constituents back home and make this country a safer place. This is a bill on which we can find consensus, and it is real. It would solve a lot of these problems that these terrible tragedies that unfortunately unfold far too often. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to share my priorities before the Judiciary Committee. The work that you do on this committee is incredibly important, especially now. It's no secret that we have a crisis currently on our southern border, and many members of this body, including myself, have been down to see it firsthand, and it's essential that we act. That's why I come to speak in support of two bills that would go towards addressing this disaster, and it is a disaster. I've introduced two of these bills, and they were referred to this committee. The first is H.R. 3848, the Illegal Immigrant Assistance Prohibition Act. As its name suggests, this bill would prohibit discretionary program funds from going to states to provide assistance to illegal immigrants. While there are a number of carrots that draw people to come to the United States, it is uncontainable to incentivize people to come into the country illegally by providing taxpayer-funded assistance. Illegal immigrants are already generally prohibited from federal assistance programs by the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. However, states can still provide assistance through their own programs funded by state taxes. This allows for the possibility of a state to use its own tax revenues on programs to assist illegal immigrants while simultaneously leaning on federal funding for other programs in their budgets. Recent examples of this kind of spending include California's initiative to provide cash benefits to undocumented Californians and New York's Excluded Worker Relief Fund that will allow for nearly 300,000 undocumented workers in the state to be eligible for lump sum payments up to $15,600. Programs like this can be an attractive draw for someone to enter into the United States illegally, which is contrary to federal immigration policy. States should not be permitted to lean on federal funding to subsidize parts of its budget while undermining the federal immigration system. This is especially worrisome as we face a crisis along our southern border. The second piece of legislation I'd like to discuss is H.R. 4796, the Empowering Law Enforcement Act. While my first bill addresses one of the tracked illegal immigrants, this bill addresses the stick side of things by providing backup to federal immigration enforcement officials who have been hamstrung by the Biden administration. Specifically, this bill would grant state and local law enforcement inherent immigration enforcement authority to investigate, identify, apprehend, arrest, detain, or transfer a migrant that has entered into the U.S. illegally. There were 208,887 border apprehensions in August, a 317% increase from last year. And August was the second straight month with over 200,000 apprehensions. The Department of Homeland Security has warned officials to be prepared for the possibility of 350,000 to 400,000 illegal border apprehensions in October. This is a national security threat, and we must be willing to use every policy option to stem the tide, including completing the border wall, reinstituting the Remain in Mexico policy, fully reinstituting Title 42 health expulsions to protect public health, and passing both H.R. 3848 and H.R. 4796 would go a long ways towards stemming this problem, this disaster that exists at our southern border. Again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the work that's done on this committee. Thank you all for your attention on this. These are two important bills to address a disaster at our southern border. People are concerned about this. This is a health issue. This is a national security issue. It's a humanitarian issue. And I appeal to you to please consider these bills. They are important, they are applicable, and they are appropriate for this time. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Keller. Yeah, put on your mic.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler, Congressman Gomer, members of the committee. I thank you for the opportunity to speak with you about an important issue for the people of Pennsylvania's 12th Congressional District and correctional officers across the nation, and it's about reforming the Federal Bureau of Prisons, as I'll refer to the BOP. The BOP faces many challenges, some that existed prior to COVID-19 and others that were underscored or made worse by the pandemic. That is why we formed the BOP Caucus, a bipartisan, bicameral group whose mission is to ensure the safety and security of our federal prisons and improve the conditions for correctional officers, inmates, and the communities in which these facilities are located. A recent GAO report found that the Bureau of Prisons did not capture or share bureau-wide the lessons and practices discussed at its teleconferences or have an approach for ensuring facilities apply these lessons in the aftermath of COVID-19. It is critical that Congress works to bring accountability and transparency within the BOP and holds BOP leadership accountable for their decisions. Additionally, Congress must enact reform that improves the conditions inside federal prisons. The BOP's security and radio systems remain obsolete, leading to an influx of contraband and violence. In 2016, the Office of Inspector General at the Department of Justice published a report identifying major deficiencies and needed upgrades, including blind spots and broken cameras. This is unacceptable. That is why I support the Prison Camera Reform Act of 2021. Senator Ossoff is leading this effort in the Senate, and I look forward to working on similar legislation in the House. Lastly, BOP's staffing levels continue to plummet while hiring freezes are occurring nationwide. BOP Reform Caucus members, both Democrats and Republicans, work to include appropriations language to increase staffing levels, despite language from the Appropriations Committee to provide adequate levels. The BOP has remained understaffed and has relied on augmentation and reassignment to make up for its shortfalls. These methods only add to the burdens placed on our correctional officers, the inmates they secure, and the surrounding communities. It is still unknown how excessive overtime hours and dangerous conditions for inmates contribute to officer fatigue. What is clear from each of these efforts is the fact that we are here to work on these challenges together. I look forward to continuing to work on important issues such as ensuring adequate BOP staffing and improving benefits, ensuring strong implementation of the First Step Act, and streamlining the BOP's future response to emergencies. I really appreciate the time that I've had here today. Our team is committed to bringing Republicans and Democrats together to work on meaningful, lasting reform. With that, I thank you very much and yield back.
The gentleman yields back. This concludes today's hearing. We thank all of our witnesses for participating. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional materials for the record. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned just in time because there are votes on the floor. Adjourned.
We'll hear from you anytime.
You're on the committee, you don't have to.